Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Deseret News Opinion Editor Boyd Matheson.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome. Thank you for being here tonight on a great snow day here in D.C. I used to always joke as a chief of staff that if two snowflakes have a conversation, they want to close the whole city. So we appreciate all of you weathering the weather and coming today. On behalf of the Deseret News and Deseret Management Corporation, I welcome you to the Newseum here in Washington, D.C. for Integrity and Trust, Lessons from Watergate and Today. It's an important conversation. We're thrilled tonight to be joined by government and civic leaders, business leaders, thought leaders, members of staff from embassies and congressional offices and the media, and many citizens of the downtown D.C. area. So we welcome all of you here today. Appreciate you joining us. Some people really questioned those of us at the Deseret News when we said we were going to convene a conversation about integrity and trust right here in the nation's capital. Particularly at this point in time, where we're in a day where we're not debating a whole lot about principles, and we're not debating a lot about policy. Instead, we often find ourselves debating fake news, alternate facts, deceptive internet sources, half-truths, bold lies, and every possible shade of morally relative gray. And that's the challenge of our time. But this is not a new challenge. It's a challenge we've faced in this country before. At the Deseret News, we think this is exactly the right place to begin this conversation. And that's why we're convening this here today. It's very fitting that we are here at the Newseum tonight. It's an appropriate venue. It's a place that houses the history of a free press, its right and responsibility and obligation to find the truth and to build trust through transparency. That's the job. If you happen to look up as you were scurrying in from the cold tonight, you would have noticed that the First Amendment to the Constitution is chiseled into the side of this building. And that matters. Those first freedoms truly matter. And it's a blessing for all of us to be able to freely assemble and talk about integrity and trust and the truth. That we can talk about those things and share those things through our expression of our religious beliefs, through a free press, certainly, and through each of our ability to raise our voice and speak our values in the public square. I would remind all of us as we begin tonight that integrity and trust and truth don't belong to a political party or any one politician. It doesn't belong to a business or an organization or a government agency or even the media. The principles of integrity and trust are the responsibility of we the people. And that's why we're here. Author David McCullough once shared that as a young college student, he learned something from a lowly associate professor who taught him that history is not necessarily just about dates and facts or even events. David McCullough said that as soon as he heard that, he realized that history is an unending river and resource of principles and ideas to be explored. And that's precisely what we're going to do here tonight. We are going to use Watergate and two of the men who not only had a front row seat, but were deep into the game to see a truly historic application of integrity and trust from right here in Washington, D.C. In the interest of time and efficiency, I'm actually going to introduce all of our speakers together. And then they will each share a few thoughts, and then we'll move into our panel portion of the discussion. Our speakers tonight are each extraordinary in their own right. Each has an interesting perspective on integrity and trust and truth. One of them pursues truth, trust, integrity through good old-fashioned rigorous journalism and old-school shoe leather reporting. One of our panelists tonight pursues trust and truth through solid analysis, deep research, and impeccable data. And one of our panelists tonight travels the world as a religious leader of a global church organization, lifting truth, integrity into homes and hearts around the globe. So introducing each of our speakers tonight, I'm not going to list all of their accomplishments and accolades and degrees. We've printed those for you in the program. And so I'm actually going to invite our three panelists to come in and take their seats, and we're going to introduce them tonight through their principles and through something unique about them. So please help me welcome to the stage Bob Woodward, Mike Dimock, and Elder D. Todd Christofferson. I just wanted him to sit there and squirm a little bit before we go. So, Bob Woodward is a world-renowned journalist. The principle I appreciate most about Bob is restraint. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Bob learned that restraint always works. He understood that you had to have the kind of self-control that would prevent you from taking those enticing shortcuts to a story or to make assumptions. He knew that you had to have restraint to follow every lead all the way to the end and wait until the sources proved out and that truth eventually would emerge, but you had to wait for it and be patient. It's one of those disciplines, I think, in our journalism today that we're losing or may have lost that needs to be restored. Tonight's event has been well over a year in the making and has taken all kinds of different twists and turns and challenges. We had one moment where we were really struggling to find the right date, and we had conflict after conflict. And I remember getting on the phone with Bob during one of these challenging moments, and Bob started and said, "Boyd, life is about navigation, and we've got some navigating to do." And so we navigated, and we're very grateful that we have navigated all the way right here to this stage to have Bob Woodward join us tonight. Thanks for being here, Bob. Elder D. Todd Christofferson pursues a global ministry as an apostle in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He possesses a quiet confidence and a courageous humility that is lacking in many of our national and global leaders today. His brilliant mind has found a fertile field to plow on many important principles, including religious liberty and human dignity. While I'm certain on most occasions, Elder Christofferson is by far the smartest person in the room, I'm going to count tonight. His confidence enables him to observe rather than draw attention to himself, and his humility empowers him to ask questions that are both meaningful and elevating. Above all, Elder Christofferson may be the kindest and most gentle person I've ever met. He has the kind of kindness that I think might be the cure for the contempt we're currently experiencing in this city and across our country. We're grateful to have him here tonight in Washington, D.C. And finally, one of the principles I admire most about Mike Dimock is his commitment to exactness. His work at the Pew Research Center has been marked by his drive to make sure he gets to the most meaningful data through the most precise and proven methods. As polling and research continue to be revolutionized by the digital age, Mike has been at the forefront to make sure that everything they put forward is authentic, is authoritative, and that is data-driven. exactness matters to Mike and to his team. And as you will see tonight, Mike also exhibits another really important quality and principle, and that is the idea that just because you can does not mean you should. And you will see that kind of restraint from Mike tonight. He and his team could pontificate and prognosticate on any topic, but they always defer to the data. And to me, that's a sign of real leadership, that he's a leader who can check his ego at the door, and he trusts the process. He trusts the process and the principles that his team follows to deliver meaningful, powerful, insightful information that we all rely on. So very, very grateful to have Mike Dimock with us tonight. And with that, we will begin. We'll first hear from Mike Dimock, then we'll hear from Mr. Woodward, and then we'll have a few remarks from Elder Christofferson.
Thanks. Great. Thank you, Boyd, and thank you all for being here. This is fantastic. We have talked about this event for a while, and I was excited about it all along because there's so much conversation about what's going on in the moment, and that's a part of our political environment today. I think it's part of what we'll talk about now because that doesn't allow for a conversation that tries to look over a longer span, try to understand how change accumulates. At the Pew Research Center, we care a lot about people, right? How citizens are experiencing all of this, how that accumulation of experience shapes them, affects the way that they look at the world and look at politics. So the theme of trust and integrity and the theme of change over time is something that we're really excited about. So thank you for having me here today to be a part of this. Let me lay out some of the facts and information that we know about how the public has experienced this time period, and in particular what's going on now in politics, not just today, but the last decade or so. Public confidence in traditional sources of authority has been in decline. That is, as they look at the world, they're receiving information, they're questioning. And one of the places that that confidence has dropped the most steeply is around government, our government here in Washington. So let me just lay out a little bit of the data around that, and then we can talk about what that really means. There's a question that was invented in 1958 that survey researchers still use. It says, how much of the time do you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? Just about always, most of the time, or hardly ever. Now, when they invented that in 1958, they tested it, they did all the rigor that they would do, and those categories pretty much captured the spectrum of things. In fact, 73% when they first asked it said just about always or most of the time. Only a minority said hardly ever. Today, when we ask that question, north of 10% insist on volunteering that they never trust the government in Washington. That's not an option that was provided when the question was first invented. And today, when we most recently asked this question, only 18% say they just about always or most of the time trust the government in Washington. The remainder, the rest of the 80%, are saying hardly ever or insisting on never. So that's an enormous change in how people view government, and it's a long arc. And one of the steepest declines happened between 1974 and 1976, right around Watergate, when public confidence in government was really shaken by the events that were going on at the time. But it's continued to ebb and flow and cycle over time, and not to take you through it all, but to focus on the last 10 years, because the last 10 years has been one of the longest sustained periods of American distrust of their fundamental government in Washington that we've seen. It declined in the aughts, but it really bottomed out in 2008, and it hasn't recovered. Now, what is it about? Well, one thing we know from the polling that we do is that it's not ideology. It's not a bigger government, smaller government thing. It's not about people not liking the government for what it does. In fact, in the most recent poll we've done on do you want a bigger or a smaller government, the balance is 50-50, just like it was in 1976. The balance of American views about the role of government haven't changed that much. And it's not a jaundiced view about government's ability to perform. In fact, most of the federal agencies get positive ratings from the public. Even the IRS, hardly the most loved agency in our country, gets more favorable than unfavorable views from the American public for how it does its job. So this isn't an across-the-board view that government can't do its job. There are frustrations with government efficiency and effectiveness, but that's not at the core of this. The core of this is around fundamental doubts about the fairness and representativeness of our electoral system, how the public's voice is translated up, and a real deeply cynical set of expectations about the honor and motivations of elected officials today. That's the crux of public frustration right now. We've measured it in a number of different ways, and it really comes down to a lot of doubts about integrity and trust, as is our focus today. It's a combination of factors, but when you ask people what they mistrust about their elected officials, they'll go on and just continue to say yes to almost everything. But it comes down to they don't think public officials care what people like them think. They feel that elected officials put their own interests first, that they're focused on their own careers, their own power, their own party advantage, and not the public good. When asked what traits apply to elected officials, it's not that they're not smart or that they're not capable. It's that they're dishonest and that they're selfish. And so the perceptions of elected officials are really deep and negative, and that's bipartisan. That's one of the few areas of agreement across party lines when we talk to people around the country. At root, these doubts are based in some questions people have about the way our elections work. Because if you think about it, these are the people we're selecting, right? We have the power to put these people in office, yet once we put them there, we don't trust their ability to perform and do their jobs well. A lot of that distrust is around money. Money is seen as something that corrupts elected officials by making them beholden to others. It also distorts the public voice by giving some more of an opportunity to speak than others. There's an interesting public angle on this that you hear some discussion about, which is that the high cost of campaigns discourages the best people from wanting to put their hat in the ring and run for public office, and that people express the concern that one of the challenges we face in leadership today is that the very political process doesn't attract the best and the brightest to public service. And most Americans, 76%, believe that money is playing a bigger role in elections today. So this is not just a perennial concern from the public perspective. This is something that's grown and become more intense in this moment. It's more than just money. People have their doubts about the way electoral districts are drawn and whether that's fair and equitable. People think the way politics happens is inappropriate. 68% say personal insults should never be fair game in politics, yet most think that it is a big part of how our politics are run. And even the issues of campaign interference are on the public's mind these days. On the eve of the midterms this year, a majority told us that they don't feel confident that our electoral systems are secure from tampering. But beyond this confidence in the electoral process, there's a growing deeper level of uncertainty in the public's expressing that I actually find a little more of concern. The share of Americans expressing confidence in the wisdom of the American people to make political decisions has dropped. In 1997, 64% said they felt that their fellow citizens would make wise decisions over time. That's fallen to a low of 34% in 2015, before the election, saying that they're confident that their fellow citizens will make wise decisions. It rose a little bit after the 2016 election because Republican confidence went up after that election outcome, but still not back to the levels that we were seeing a decade or more ago. And in fact, one of the biggest deficiencies Americans pointed out to us in a poll earlier last year was between the 78% who say having a knowledgeable electorate is very important to an effective democracy, and only the 34% saying that a knowledgeable electorate is something that describes us well today. So what makes these changes in public views of governance and elected officials, I think, particularly feel particularly destabilizing is they're happening as a part of two other big societal trends. One is the massive escalation of partisan hostility in the environment today. Boyd mentioned this before. It's woven into this distrust and this divisiveness in politics and the public frustration with their elected officials. And a second big societal trend is a fundamental reshaping of the information environment, right? A decentralization, a disintermediation of how information flows. The gatekeepers of old are gone. Information's flowing all over. And people are having trouble navigating a blend of fact, opinion, and misinformation that all seems to be intertwined and troubling. Now, I'm eager to get to the conversation, so I won't go into depth on those two other trends, other than to say that the partisan divide in our country is less about ideological extremism. It's not that this country has more extremists than centrists than in the past. It's more about identity and fear. When you look at how divided our society is, it's hard to find a measure that says we're more divided than we were in the 1970s and 1960s over policy issues. What's happened is that all of our divisions have collapsed onto a single dimension, a red versus blue fight. And they're all going down to that same division, no matter what the issue, right? And there are 5 outcomes of that collapsing that I think are really important to keep in mind. One is people perceive a greater sense of distance between their side and the other side. Even if they're not actually that much farther apart on any particular issue, the fact that we're lined up on opposite sides of the field on everything makes those distances feel farther and makes the threat of the other side having control of the system of power feel that much more troubling to people. A second is that the normal paths to compromise are blocked without cross-cutting issues that can achieve a reach across partisan lines in Washington. A third is that both sides feel aggrieved right now in politics. When you ask Democrats and Republicans whether their side is losing more often than it's winning, they all feel like they're losing. Everybody feels like the tide is against them. And when they feel that way, what do they ask of their leaders? They want their leaders to stand up for them. They want them to stand up against the tide that's been pushing back on their side. And that makes compromise not something to be sought for, but something that is resisted. Fourth, the angriest voices rise to the surface in this disintermediated environment, even in the information that members of Congress and elected officials are getting themselves. And fourth, our collective confidence that we even share a common set of facts and values has been shaken. 78% of Americans tell us that when it comes to important issues, Democrats and Republicans don't only disagree on the policies, they disagree on the very facts. And at that point, then there's no room for agreement. There's no room for compromise. There's no room for coming together. So without trust in the institutions of government and the leaders, all of these factors feel even more destabilizing to the American public. This is what's describing this particular moment. It's this confluence of factors that's been shaping the environment for the last 10 years or so, but its roots go far deeper. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm shocked to hear that there's more distrust in government. Absolutely shocked. Want to talk a little bit about Watergate, and it was Senator Ervin who led the Senate Watergate Committee and led it quite brilliantly, because that is the gold standard of congressional investigations, and they got testimony from everyone, and they discovered the tapes, and it was quite an event at a time. Are there people here who remember that period? Raise your hands. Good. You could, in Washington, you could leave the Washington Post newsroom during the Senate hearings, and on little televisions there would be a live broadcast on all the networks and on PBS. Then you would get in a cab, and the cab driver would have the radio on of the hearings, and you could go to an office up, say, in the Senate or the House or in the federal government, and there people would still be watching the hearings, and so you wouldn't miss much. It was continuous. Anyway, Senator Ervin asked in his final report about Watergate, what was Watergate? And his answer in 1974, which was, I believe, correct but incomplete, but his answer was Watergate was really an effort by Nixon and his people to destroy the process of nominating and electing a president. It wasn't just a burglary, it was a series of campaign espionage activities, sabotage activities to really destroy Senator Muskie, who was the leading candidate for the Democrats, and really guided it in a very dramatic way. So Senator McGovern, who was perceived and turned out to be a weaker candidate. But since 1974, when Nixon resigned, there's been a lot of work, a lot of investigations about how Watergate was much more. It was a mindset that reflected Nixon's personality. And there were 5 wars that Nixon conducted. The first was in 1970, 2 years before the Watergate burglary, in which he approved a top-secret plan called the Houston Plan to authorize break-ins and wiretaps on what were called domestic security threats. These were the anti-Vietnam War activists. And in 1971, according to one of the tape recordings, again, this is literally a year before the Watergate burglary, Nixon says we need to make sure. This is almost inconceivable. I remember the first time I read the transcript of this. Nixon is saying, gee, there were some documents over in one of the think tanks in Washington, the Brookings Institution, and Nixon thought showed that Johnson delayed and did some things in the 72 campaign to cause Nixon problems. So Nixon said, let's blackmail Lyndon Johnson. Now think for a moment about John Adams saying, gee, can't we do something to blackmail George Washington? But here was Nixon proposing this. He wanted to get the documents and was so hyper about getting the documents. He said, let's go send a team over to the Brookings Institution, quote, blow the safe, get the safe cracked, and if you listen to a sequence of tapes, he does not let this go. So the first target in these wars were really the people who opposed the Vietnam War. The second targets was the news media, in which Nixon and his people set up a group in the White House called the Plumbers to track down leaks. The team that later did the Watergate burglary broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in California to get dirt on Ellsberg, who had leaked the Pentagon Papers. 17 wiretaps were authorized on White House aides and reporters, and in one tape, Nixon was meeting with the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and, quote from Nixon, he said, the press is your enemy, has an echo today. The third war was at the Democrats, in which the Watergate operation was set up. Initially started out to be a $1 million plan that was presented to Attorney General John Mitchell at the time. It proposed kidnap teams that they literally hired Senator Muskie's chauffeur, a man named Elmer Wyatt, paid him $1,000 a month as he transferred documents between Muskie's Senate office and his presidential campaign headquarters. Elmer Wyatt photocopied all of the documents and gave them to John Mitchell and the Nixon re-election campaign. There were so many documents that Elmer Wyatt had to rent an apartment midway between the two offices and a Xerox machine. So John Mitchell had full visibility on the Muskie strategy, campaign plans, polling data, and so forth. Part of this operation was they hired a retired Secret Service agent to work on Teddy Kennedy's security detail and spy and report on him. So after the Watergate burglars were caught, the fourth war was against the system of justice. This was really literally the cover-up, and there are tape recordings that so vividly, I was talking to Todd earlier about one tape, March 21st, 1973, an extraordinary meeting between Nixon and John Dean, who was the counsel to Nixon in the White House. And Dean went in and said, we're being blackmailed by the Watergate burglars and their supervisors. We're going to have to pay them for their silence, a clear, illegal obstruction of justice. And Nixon says, well, how much will it cost? And Dean said, $1 million. And Nixon said, no emotional response at all, except $1 million, I know where we can get that in cash. And then the tape shows that 12 times in a long meeting, Nixon orders the payment of this money to people to lie to the grand jury or maintain their silence. Interestingly enough, Nixon's fifth war was a war on history after he resigned, in which he kept claiming that Watergate was a blip, really didn't mean much. Of course, thousands of hours of Nixon tape recordings show that is not true at all. I remember, and the whole question became, when is Nixon's party, the Republicans, going to turn on him? And after Nixon resigned, Barry Goldwater, the senator from Arizona who ran against Lyndon Johnson in '64 and lost, but he was considered the conscience of the Republican Party. And as the conscience of the Republican Party, after Nixon left office, Goldwater invited my colleague Carl Bernstein and myself up to his apartment, in which he, extraordinary evening with him, he read from his personal diary. And he described a meeting on August 7th, 1974, and which he and the Republican leaders went to visit Nixon in the White House. And Nixon knew he was going to be impeached, charged by the House of Representatives, certainly if he stayed in office, go on trial in the Senate, where he would need 34 votes to stay in office. And so in the course of the conversation, according to Goldwater's diary, the president asked Goldwater, Barry, how many votes do I have in the Senate? And Goldwater said, well, I've taken a survey. I've taken a poll, Mr. President, and you have 4 votes in the Senate, and one of them is not mine. The next night, Nixon announced that he was resigning. Senator Ervin also asked the question, which was a potent one, I believe, and that is, why did we have Watergate? What occurred? What was driving Nixon, who was at the center of this? And Senator Ervin's answer is that it was a lust for political power, that there was a sense of entitlement Nixon had, that it was central to not just him, but to the country, that he stay in office, so he adopted all of the illegal means that have come to be known for Watergate. And the last thought I would offer is how much understanding did Nixon have about what happened? The day Nixon resigned, which was August 9th, 1974, he had we gave a farewell address in the East Wing of the White House, and he had his wife, 2 daughters, 2 son-in-laws there, and all of his friends and the cabinet were in the audience, and it was Nixon unscripted. Nothing. It was just talking off the top of his head. He was sweating. He was very emotional, and he at one point in this speech, he just spontaneously kind of went like this, "This is why I called you all together." And then he said, quote, "Always remember, others may hate you, but those who hate you don't win unless you hate them, and then you destroy yourself." Think of the wisdom at that moment that Nixon had. He realized that the hating, which was in many ways the piston of his administration, the hating destroyed him, not his opponents. And that in that moment you see a kind of self-understanding that we don't necessarily associate with Nixon, but also we see not just a political lesson, but a wonderful lesson for all of us, everyone. Hating, in the end, doesn't destroy your enemies. It is the hating that destroys you. Thank you very much.
Bob has given us a thorough review of a time and a period and a series of incidents and undertakings that Mike Dimock has given us some sense of some of the fruits that may have come from that time. I wanted to say just a word about the influence on me of this period and the experience, the part of it that I shared, which was by no means all that Bob has described, but he sets a wonderful, clear context. Personally, I feel fortunate that integrity and trustworthiness were emphasized in my life at home growing up and fortified by a religious upbringing and teaching. I can't claim perfection, but I'm grateful for that training at an early age. I do recall at about age 5, I think, 5 or 6, crossing the street to the grocery store across from our home and stealing a candy bar. My mother found me a little later with the evidence on my face, chocolate it was, as I recall, and carried me back across the street with a dime she had loaned me to pay that I had to earn back afterward. And in tears and almost fear of prison, I confessed. And that experience put an end to my life of crime. The Watergate experience taught me the importance of integrity and trust like nothing else. A defining experience that came to me fresh out of law school. I was 27 when that Watergate break-in occurred, and 29 when I left the judge's service, Judge Sirica's service there. I think Bob was maybe 1 year older than I, and obviously much wiser. He was 14, I must have been 13. Obviously a much wiser man with seniority. But he and I both majored in English in undergraduate school, and he went on to the Fourth Estate. I chose law. And as Watergate began to unfold during my first months with Judge Sirica, I began to have doubts about my choice of a profession. G. Gordon Liddy was a lawyer and a key player in that break-in and the plumbers unit and many other things that Bob's talked about. John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States, and others. But as time went on, I chose to look to others in that profession that gave me the courage and hope that I had chosen well. I think of Archibald Cox, who was first in the role of special prosecutor, followed by Leon Jaworski. Giants, titans of the law, I felt. And Charles Allen Wright, who was a law professor at the University of Texas and represented President Nixon in much of these proceedings, but did it with integrity, did it well, did it so that he had honest representation, but only that. And it was, to me, a great source of comfort, if you will, and strength that those who followed this profession and did it with integrity made a great difference. In fact, maybe lawyers were guilty getting us into it, but it was other lawyers who helped get us out. I was moved, really, as I look back on it, by Judge Sirica's example, his personal example. He was careful, he was thoughtful, he was courageous. When the time came to decide about the Watergate tapes, the tapes that had been subpoenaed from the White House, and it was a decision to be made with precious little legal precedent. It seemed like the last time a subpoena had gone to the White House in a criminal case was to President Thomas Jefferson in the Aaron Burr treason trial, when a letter was subpoenaed. There was an accommodation worked out in that case, and so it never did get finally decided. So the judge was plowing some very new ground. And it seemed to him and to me that his decision to enforce the subpoena and require the president to produce those tape recordings was equally likely to either land him in hot water with higher courts and public opinion that would judge him as an overreaching would-be prosecutor, as the other possibility that he would be regarded as courageous and heroic in making that decision. You know how it turned out. But he didn't know at the time he acted, and I remember the moment when he sat at his desk poised with the pen in hand before he finally signed that order and opinion, and then finally saying it's right and going forward. I remember his anger that someone in his courtroom in that initial break-in trial had to be lying, was perjuring themselves. Someone lying in his courtroom was a personal affront, a real offense to him who valued above all honesty. And then his example of ensuring that there would be no leaks from his chambers of the content of these tapes. He was examining them in camera, in private, to determine what was relevant, what was not. What was relevant would go on to the special prosecutor, what was not would be protected by privilege claimed by the president. But he was insistent that there would be no leak, even though it seemed like it was universally predicted that as soon as he got them, the contents would be on the street. He took great precautions to avoid that. he wanted to listen to them with me together so that we could discuss them and he could make his decision. He decided it would be done in the jury room behind his courtroom, which was an interior room. No one could approach it without passing security. No one could eavesdrop. There were no windows. No one could eavesdrop electronically through glass or anything of the kind. But he still insisted that we use headphones. So there wasn't even any sound to be overheard in that situation. And as you know, he was true to that, what he regarded as a trust. To hear those tape recordings, and maybe some of you have, Bob, are they available still at the archives for people who may want to go and listen? I think some of it at least is still publicly accessible. But to hear them was a rare opportunity, a rare experience, to hear the actual conversations, to hear the voices as they spoke. And the recordings in the Oval Office were very clear. The ones from his office, the president's office in the adjoining executive office building were difficult to discern, to get the text, to hear the conversation. But in the Oval Office, it was clear as a bell. Bob has mentioned the tape from the meeting of March 21st, 1973, between President Nixon and John Dean, the White House counsel. He's described what was said there about we could come up with $1 million. The only problem is how do you distribute it without it being traced? That seemed to be the president's only concern. And I remember the shock, frankly, that both the judge and I felt in that moment. We still harbored the hope, maybe we were naive, that the president was not involved himself, although others were, certainly beyond those who conducted the break-in. But to hear that and to see his overt, direct, willing participation in a conspiracy to obstruct justice was disheartening, to say the least. It hit the judge very hard. He said it was like a blow to the gut, a punch to the gut. This is from somebody who had an amateur boxing career before he became a judge or a lawyer, and he knew what he was saying. I felt the same. We were so discouraged that we closed up shop early that day and went home and had no heart to do anything else for some time. We knew what would happen several months later. But I was also encouraged by the many good people that I met in government during that same period. People who were, in fact, public servants, who hadn't a personal agenda but wanted to be of use and accomplish something of worth in their service. That left me not disillusioned, obviously disappointed, but not disillusioned with government and those who serve in government and what the possibilities are for good government. And I feel that same way today. Out of that experience, I resolved to be more committed to the teachings of my youth, recognizing that people can go wrong, even regular folks, and apparently decent and somewhat normal people or very accomplished people. People aren't born bad, but they can, even with many positive things in their life, still turn to dishonesty and abandoned integrity. And I've been anxious since that time to do what I could to promote those values that I was blessed with and the traits of integrity as broadly as I can, especially among the rising generation. My position in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints fortunately gives me that opportunity and, as we say, a bully pulpit to preach that gospel. And I appreciate you letting me do that here tonight from this pulpit. Thank you.
right, we are recording, and I have 18 hours of questions. Are you ready?
You don't have an 18-hour audience.
I don't know. I think there's a few 18 hours in this group tonight. And I do have to tell the group that backstage we had gone through several different ways how we might roll into this discussion tonight, which is a confirmation of my new book, which will be called Starting with Plan Z. We tried A, B, C, and D, and then these three got in the green room together, and they all decided they didn't just want to watch each other's speeches from the green room, that they wanted to be out here on the stage. And so that's why we're out here for this discussion, and I'm really looking forward to this. So, Bob, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to go right to the restraint question. So often in the media today, the test is to be out first, to be out quick, to have instant certainty of what happened and why. And I want you to address that first from a Watergate standpoint. How did you and your partner get to that point of restraint to make sure you had it right? And then how do you see that playing out today?
We had a great series of editors, but Ben Bradley was the top editor. And he would always say, like the night Nixon resigned, don't gloat. And he ran around the newsroom and said, don't gloat. And most importantly, after Nixon resigned, Katharine Graham, who was the publisher, the owner of the Washington Post, wrote Carl Bernstein and myself a personal letter that was private until she published it in her memoirs. And the letter said, okay, you guys did some of the stories about Nixon. Now don't start thinking too much of yourselves. And then she said, I want to give you some advice, which I think would resonate with you, Todd, particularly. And she said, my advice is beware the demon pomposity, and that pomposity defeats lots of people and lots of businesses and lots of ways of life. And I think if you look at the world now of 2019, that the demon pomposity is present in the news media a lot, in politics, in even in religion at times, where people think that this is the way it is, that there is certainty in the voice of too many people who shouldn't be certain, and in fact cannot be certain. And so that creates this environment, and you put that with the internet and the culture of impatience and speed. Give it to me now, explain it to me now. And happily, when Carl and I were working on Watergate stories, we could work for weeks on a story, and we would write on typewriters. People remember what those were?
Heard of those.
And we had 6-ply paper where there would be an original and 5 carbons attached, and then send the draft around to the editors. We would meet, they would ask questions about sources, and so there was a vetting that took place. But again, it was not perfect, and as is pretty well known, we made some mistakes, some buttes, actually. And so the process was never perfect, but we now, in this environment, we now have a culture where literally anyone can say anything about anyone, and there's, okay, that's out there, and it may be the furthest thing from the truth.
Elder Christofferson, in your working with Judge Sirica on this, were there moments where you wanted to maybe skip a few steps from the legal process, or where you might have had some instant certainty where you thought where things needed to go that you had to show some restraint or be cautious in?
Yeah, I didn't dare if I ever thought of it with him. But if I could respond just a moment to what you said, I think there is this, call it pomposity or what you will, there is a tendency, I think, when someone gets to a certain level of achievement or prominence, to begin to feel like the rules don't apply to him or to her. It may be a little what you're talking about, where you think you know best, and I'm in this position and I can rule from Mount Olympus and don't have to bother with the details. That's a danger. I think we've got to feel accountability, I think, always, at least to God, if nowhere else, but certainly I think we have many levels of accountability, and I think the media can help in that by the kind of reporting you're talking about, where it's considered, it's thoughtful, it's careful, it's not just pursuing an agenda. Yeah. I'll tell you, the media did that with me. I'll tell you how. When the action was at the courthouse, the judge said, "You go talk to him, you're the spokesman." And I was the most important guy in the world. There was nobody more significant in earth than I was at that moment. Then the action shifted to the Senate Select Committee on the Hill. Nobody knew me. Nobody cared if I lived or died.
Well, a lot of people thought you were Deep Throat. You could have been.
The press kept me humble by abandoning me when nothing was happening at court.
So Bob, as you look at the media's role today, and you talked about the blurring of those lines. Mike has mentioned the blurring of the lines from what is fact and what is reporting and what is anchoring versus what is opinion or what is prognostication. How are you seeing that played out? What do you wish the journalists today would do a little more or a little less?
Well, I think we've got to slow down. And what I found in doing this book on Trump is that I didn't do television and I didn't do articles for the Post and had the luxury of time. And the luxury of time is really central to anything, I believe. And so I could hear about something and then I could go to people and get notes and get documents. And in fact, one of the painful self-discoveries was how lazy I had become. And I would go see people or have them over to my house. And I learned from Bernstein that when we were working on Watergate, how essential it was to go knock on doors at night without an appointment. And there was a moment in working on this book. Let me take you to that. I had the phone number of somebody who worked in the White House, very important, home phone number. And it was one of those fork in the road moments. And it was 11 o'clock at night. And I thought, well, I'll call him, it's kind of late. And so I kind of thought, you idiot. It's 11 o'clock at night. You're 74 years old. I was 74. Go to bed. But not out of anything other than I had the number and there was the telephone, so I pick up the phone and I call him and said, I identified myself and I'm working on this book and would like to talk to you. And he said, yeah, call the office tomorrow, the brush off. And I said, well, I'd really like to see you tonight. And he called me a name and said, it's 11 o'clock at night. And I said, I know that, but I'm only 4 minutes from your house. And he said, 4 minutes from my house? How do you know where I live? And I said, I have good research. And he said, I think a fork in the road moment for him. He said, okay, come on over. You're just 4 minutes. So I came. And it was, there's something about somebody's home where they feel much more comfortable. I lucked out. His wife was out of town. And so we talked. It was almost dawn when I left. And then I was able to come back, and I kept saying, notes, documents, you have any notes, documents? And no, we can't take anything from the White House. And then finally, about maybe the third or fourth interview, any notes that would give us the date on that? And he said, well, let me go upstairs and see if I've got anything. So he goes upstairs and he comes down. Boxes of material. And I have to reflect back on that fork in the road moment and the realization, and that's of how lazy it was to kind of, first of all, I couldn't go to the White House. They wouldn't let me in. You go to the White House and you get press release statements. You don't get the truth. And so how far, and this is the ultimate question for my business, how far are we in our process from getting, you have a process, right, that's rigorous and so forth, and you have a spiritual process, don't you, Todd? In other words, you're going to counsel somebody.
That's rigorous.
Yeah. And I think we've lost not had the full understanding how important process is.
Wonderful. I'm going to jump down to Mike. You mentioned some of the elements of trust and how we have this big distrust of government, big organizations, and we seem to see that starting to spill over, to fray a little bit of the fabric of society and the trust that we have in our communities and the trust that we have for one another as neighbors. What does the data tell us about how trust is moving all the way down to the individual level?
Yeah, it is and it isn't. I think you can paint too negative of a story. One thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that a lot of what I was describing is very much focused on this city, and then even within this city, one building on Capitol Hill and one building on Pennsylvania Avenue, the elected officials and their motives and the people right around them. When you look at how people view their communities, from a governance perspective, from a community involvement perspective, from the ability as a citizen to play a role in decision-making in communities, it's not nearly as dire or as negative. Overall views of the federal government in Washington have gone down, mostly focused on Congress, but state and local governments remained viewed pretty positively, even as they were making a lot of tough choices after the market crash in 2008, when they were the ones having to cut benefits, to cut back schools, to do a lot of tough decisions to balance budgets. Publics were still giving them much more credit for doing their jobs than they were Washington. So it's not an across-the-board phenomenon. But the thing that's troubling at a community level is the partisanship, because the partisan element that I was describing that's very much about these two teams aligned, and they seem to disagree on everything, then that's permeating down to the individual level, to the neighborhood level, to the neighbor level, where one of the things people want to find out is, well, do I want to know their politics? Do I not want to talk about politics? And that's been an old saying, right? Don't talk religion and politics at the table if you don't know what you're getting into. But today, politics has become more deep set, and the caricatures and stereotypes, and this is on both sides, that Democrats express about Republicans and Republicans express about Democrats, are very deep-seated now. So you see that showing up in the ways people talk about their willingness to interact with people, the kind of neighborhoods they want to live in, that those conversations about politics with people they disagree with are some of the most uncomfortable situations some people can imagine, and they'll do a lot to try to avoid them. And I think it's because, again, of that sense that I'm not going to find any area of commonality with that person, right? Because it seems that we're apart on everything. And that's something we've been seeing really accelerating within even just the last 20 years. that sense of across-the-board disagreement.
Okay, excellent. Elder Christofferson, you mentioned the impact of the Watergate experience and your determination to live with integrity. Were there moments either in that process or in your legal career or now as a leader in a worldwide organization where you felt that tested or stretched?
Well, I think it's not uncommon in a legal career, and maybe this is typical in others, where a client is so desperate or so anxious to win or to have something go his way that he wants you to do something that's illegal, and you have to stand up and say, no, I can't do that. I've had some of that, but I remember a very simple experience where I was late getting a filing to one of the federal agencies by about 3 minutes, and I rushed in and saw a pile of papers there, similar filings that had been come in that day, and they were all date stamped, and nobody was there. I could hear some voices in the background, but nobody was out front at the desk. But the stamp was there. And I said, do I stamp my own paper? What can I do? I finally just left it on top of the stack and left. But even in small things, I think you have to be careful. When it seems, quote, you won't get caught, or it doesn't matter, or it's just too small, I don't think you can make an exception. It just, it puts you on that slippery slope we talk about. Yeah. And you may do fine, you may not, but you don't have any assurance if you step off the rock.
Yeah, definitely. Bob, you mentioned a couple of the moments for you and Carl Bernstein in your process in terms of the questions to the grand jury and some sources. Describe that. What was kind of bumping up against that line like? What did you see there?
Well, it was evident that to us there was a cover-up, and the question was, what did the grand jury know? And we received permission from our lawyers, Edward Bennett Williams, to go talk to grand jurors, not to be aggressively asking questions, but go and just kind of smile and say, do you know anything we should know? And we were unsuccessful, and we've been criticized rightly for doing this, but I'm not sure in a case like Watergate, where there clearly is obstruction of justice going on, that reporters can't go and ask that question, and there's a way to do it, to kind of say, do you want to be a volunteer? But I think there's in this the theme that we're trying to address here. There's for my business, and it reflects on your business and your business and your business also, and I think everyone's, and that is we try to gather information and be as fact-driven as possible, but we don't understand the meaning of the facts we have. And if I may tell, I will compress this story about one of the experiences I have, which goes way back to right after Nixon resigned. And it was September 1974, Gerald Ford was president, and on a Sunday morning, Ford went on television and announced he was giving a full pardon to Nixon for Watergate. Right. I think he did it on a Sunday morning hoping no one would notice. But it was widely noticed, but not by me. I was asleep, and Bernstein called me up, and Carl, who then and still has the ability to say what's going on in the fewest words with the most drama, said, I'm going to paraphrase here. He said,
thank you.
The SOB pardoned the SOB. And I felt really good that I'd figured out what had happened. And I thought, it's perfect. It's the final corruption of Watergate. There was an aroma. I mean, here, Nixon's the only person to get a pardon. Ford gets the presidency. This aroma of they had made a swap.
Made a deal.
Made a deal. And I thought that, I think you thought that, didn't you? Judge Sirica thought that there was something untoward about the pardon.
He really was troubled by that.
Yes.
He didn't have a firm conclusion, but he felt, he leaned that way, I think.
Yes, and the public did too, and when Ford ran against Carter, he probably lost because of the pardon and his association with Nixon.
I think so.
So this was my firm conclusion, and 25 years later, I undertook one of my book projects, a book called Shadow, about the legacy of Watergate in the presidencies of Ford through Clinton. And I called Ford up and said I'd like to talk to him about the pardon, figuring he would say, I'm sorry, I have a golf tournament. I can't, but see, this again, you often misjudge people, or I certainly do. And I thought, Ford won't talk. But he turned out to be the most direct, perhaps honest person in public life I ever encountered. And so this is 25 years later, and I had the luxury of time, so I got all the memoirs and legal memos and interviewed Ford about 6 or 7 times. What really happened? And this is that quest for, come on, let's get the story straight, because I'm not sure the first go around we get it. And the last interview with Ford, I think it was about the 6th interview, we're sitting there in his little home in Rancho Mirage, California. He had a home in Colorado and would alternate the interviews, and tape recorder going for history. And why did you pardon Nixon? And he said, you keep asking that question. And I said, I don't think you've answered it. And to my astonishment, he said, you're right, I haven't. I'm going to tell you what happened. I haven't even told Betty this, his wife. Said, here's what occurred. A week before Nixon resigned, Al Haig, Nixon's chief of staff, came to see him and privately said, if you pardon Nixon, he will resign, you get the presidency. But I need a guarantee to carry back to the president that he's going to be pardoned. And I'm sitting there, I go, holy, there was a deal. And so I said, so there was a deal. He said, no. And he got as excited as I think he's ever been. He said, no, there was no deal. Here's what happened. Here's why I pardoned Nixon. And he said, I have to take you to, and this is what you try to do as a journalist, get inside somebody's experience. And he said, so first of all, he said, I never wanted to be president. And so I got the job. Agnew resigned. I was nominated. I'm vice president. And I become president. And he said there was no deal. I knew I was going to become president anyway. Yeah, regardless, that if somebody offers you some, let's exchange this and you're going to get it anyway. And
sleeves off my vest.
Yeah. And so, but he said, here's the world I was living in. I was president for 30 days. All the questions. Life was all about Nixon. What's going to happen to Nixon? And he said in this plaintive voice, I'll never forget, I needed my own presidency. The country needed a new presidency. I had to get Nixon into the history books, off the front page. And so we're in the middle of the Cold War, economic trouble. He had a letter from the Watergate prosecutor, Leon Jaworski, saying, we're going to investigate Nixon as a private citizen. He certainly will, because of the evidence on the tapes, be indicted, go to trial, may probably go to jail. So Ford said, we're going to have 2 or 3 more years of Watergate. Could not do it. The only way to get out of this trap was to pardon Nixon. And so I wrote in the book that actually what Ford did was gutsy and not corrupt. And real quickly, I'm sorry, but this has a sequence, a learning sequence for me. That Caroline Kennedy, the daughter of John F. Kennedy, called me up and said she and her uncle, Teddy Kennedy, read what I'd written in the book. And they agreed, and she said, we've decided to give the Profiles in Courage Award to Gerald Ford, not for being president, but for pardoning Richard Nixon. And I didn't go to the ceremony at the Kennedy Library, but I watched it. There was Ford kind of vindicated. Teddy Kennedy saying, at the time in '74, I said the pardon was almost a criminal act. Actually, it was in the national interest, the tradition of my brother, the late president's book, Profiles in Courage, of politicians who do themselves in. Self-sabotage, really, for the national interest. And so I'm watching this, and I'm just to share what a cold shower, how humbling, how humiliating, quite frankly, because I would have staked my life in '74 that this was corrupt, and then you look at it 25 years later through the lens of history, and it's the opposite. Yeah. It's courage. And you can't have that experience in my business and not then get in the mode of, yeah, it looks this way, this is what's going on, this is, maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe we have it wrong.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. I want to shift to some applications now as we look at the lessons from Watergate and where we are today. Elder Christofferson, you recently spoke and were part of the G20 Faith Forum down in Argentina ahead of the G20 Economic Summit. You were with faith leaders from around the world. What do you see as the role as we look at trust and integrity? What's the role of religious institutions and faith organizations to really promote this idea of pluralism, of integrity, of trust, civility in society today?
Well, I feel like faith organizations, churches and others, are greatly benefited by pluralism and by preparing themselves and taking a role in society in that context, not trying to dominate, not trying to dictate, but being a voice among others in a pluralistic society that evaluates and weighs and determines through the government processes and judicial processes and all the rest where we're going to go and what values are going to be enshrined in law and so forth. One of our articles of faith in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is, we claim the privilege of worshiping Almighty God according to the dictates of our own conscience, and allow all in that same privilege. Let them worship how, where, or what they may. I think the participation of religious bodies has to be on that basis. We're not controlling, but we are a voice, and we're entitled to be heard like everyone else is. I think that generally a religious body wouldn't pursue something that's just to benefit their own liturgy or their own processes or their own unique expressions of faith, but something that's more general, something that argues for tolerance in society or that promotes justice in society, that's broader, is a legitimate place. And you hear once in a while the criticism, well, if you're speaking from a religious standpoint, you're trying to impose your religion on someone. You're trying to impose your values on someone. Well, frankly, every law, every regulation is an enshrinement of somebody's values. It's all based on values and perspectives that different people argue for and that enough share that it gets adopted. So I think a religious voice or a non-religious voice all have the opportunity and should have the opportunity to express what they think are the appropriate values, the ones that best serve the common good. Most of our criminal laws, if you think about it, have a religious belief at their base, at their foundation. But it's not a right to impose, but it's not in position to argue for what you think is right any more than it would be for the Sierra Club, you know, on an environmental matter, to argue their point of view. But there has to be a robust debate. And what troubles me sometimes in our society is that with the growth of moral relativism, where truth is whatever I say it is for me, and there's not an ultimate truth or an objective truth, that anytime you disagree, it becomes a personal attack. You know, if you disagree with my position because that's my truth, then you're attacking me. And so you can't have a reasoned discussion. You can't have an objective weighing of the merits of one side.
How about tolerance for non-believers?
Yeah.
Do you feel tolerance?
For sure.
They have the same.
Exactly. And I think that's pluralism. That's the real pluralism. And that's what I opt for, and what we opt for as a church, is that we have a voice, but everybody has a voice. And that if you cut it off by saying disagreeing with me is intolerant, that leads to intolerance in the name of tolerance in the end. But if you can say we can disagree, we can argue, we can present our case, we can make the best persuasive approach and argument we possibly can, but we live with the results in a society, in a pluralistic society, with the decisions that are made in the normal course. So my only point here is that everybody should have a voice, religions included, but everybody has to be on the same level playing field making their case. Nobody gets to dominate. Nobody gets a superior position, only as they're able to persuade others to their point of view. I wrote down something that, if I find it quickly in these notes, that Joseph Smith said once on that subject. He said, "If I esteem mankind to be in error, shall I bear them down? No, I'll lift them up. And in their own way, if I cannot persuade them, my way is better. I will not seek to compel any man to believe as I do, only by the force of reasoning, for truth will cut its own way." I think that's the approach. We all will argue for truth as we see it, but it has to be by persuasion, not coercion.
Great point. And Mike, I think you can weigh in there in terms of kind of this tribalism, and it's only true if my political party said it or the people I agree with said it. What are the numbers telling us in terms of our willingness to just buy into something or to reject something out of hand just because of who it's coming from?
That's invariably true. And you see it not only in what people believe the facts are around a situation, you know, like any of the current political debates we might be having, but even in how people define terms and language. We did a test online last year with a group of representative Americans, and we asked them we gave them a series of sentences, and we said, well, is this a sentence that's based in fact, where there are verifiable elements to it that you could prove? We're not asking you whether it actually is true or false, but is it a factual statement, or is it an opinion statement? Is this something that everybody could have different views on? It's based in values and beliefs. And what it turned out was that people's partisan lenses sort of override the fact and opinion. So if it was a statement about Barack Obama wasn't born in Kenya, well, we weren't saying, do you believe he was or wasn't? Do you think the facts are that he was or wasn't? We were saying, is that a statement that could be tested in fact? And people saw it through their partisan lens more than through the ability to see it as fact or opinion. But what I think is sort of interesting about a lot of this is a debate that's been happening in the scientific community as well, in science communication, because one of the challenges is that facts are often fuzzier than you want them to be in the real world. I mean, even your story about the facts of the case around the pardon, you know, there was a fact, there was something on Ford's mind when he made that choice, right? But it was probably more complicated than you would ever pin down to one single set of instances. And the same is true with science or the kind of work we do in measuring public opinion or measuring demographics. How many undocumented immigrants come into the US in any given year? What's public opinion about the president in this given month? Those are things that can be measured and understood better, but every measurement has some error to it, right? Every measure is imprecise in its own ways. And I think part of where we've come as a society is we've probably expected too much of our measures. We expect perfection, and then when something's off a little bit, we take it as a lie. We take it as a reason to disbelieve a whole package of information, reject it all because that one measure was off by a little bit. I think it's true for all of the professions. You know, the journalist gets the one piece wrong, even though they were trying hard, and then you can discount all of it, right? And you're hearing a lot of that these days. See, there's the one lie, there's the one mistake, so then you can ignore it all. The same for any kind of measurement. So one thing you mentioned before a little bit, Bob, was process. You know, how can people better understand the process behind how facts are found, how information is gathered, whether it's a journalist doing their job, whether it's a social scientist like myself or a scientist. Understand the process behind how information is gathered a little bit. That might help understand both how much certainty you can have about any facts in the world, and maybe even be able to separate fact from opinion from misinformation a little bit better.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So Bob, my greatest fear in leading up to this entire event has been I was waiting for the report that you had showed up at Elder Christofferson's home at 11 o'clock at night, saying, I'm Bob Woodward from the Washington Post. Do you have a minute? I'd like to ask you a question. I am going to give you one question, Watergate related. What did you want to know that was going on in Judge Sirica's mind or in the court or things that Elder Christofferson was probably a part of as you and Bernstein were going through that process?
Well, what's interesting about the tapes decision that Judge Sirica and Todd made and the Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court, we now look back, it was 8-0 turnover the tapes, and it seems...
Easy decision, yeah.
Easy decision, obvious decision. And I remember at the time thinking, well, it's actually not so obvious that a president should be entitled to some sort of private consultation. And the genius of the decision was only Watergate related segments of the tape, and there are portions of the tapes which are still not released, still not available. And I think that was a very sound kind of, it wasn't, in a way it was divided the baby, didn't it?
It did, and I give Judge Sirica full credit for that. His idea was to bring him in camera, in private. He would be the referee as to relevance.
Too bad he's not around now to do something about the government shutdown. How do you think...
I think we might have a few agreements with that one tonight.
How did you think about... what would he think about the wall?
Now, I want everyone to note that he did not obey the rules on either front of this.
I think he's looking down from heaven and saying, I'm glad I'm out of there.
All right. As we bring things full... Oh, go ahead,
I
please.
just add one word, and again, I take this from the Watergate experience, but in the court, and this is obviously part of the structure of courts, that there's some measure of civility. I mean, you have to function that way. You have to restrain yourself and act according to the rules and the procedures of a court, and it can be pretty rigid. But the even outside of court, I hope, I pray, that there can be greater civility, greater respect of the kind you're talking about in process and in giving people, in some cases, the benefit of the doubt, but getting the facts, always searching for the facts and not being too quick to judge, but to act civilly.
Yes, but at the same time, there's a part in my business and all of our businesses where you don't get answers.
True.
Unfortunately. And the big issue in Watergate, I always thought, was why? Why Nixon clearly was smart. He clearly had a strategic vision in foreign affairs. What was that sense? And if there had been a strong lawyer in his midst who would go in and slam down his fist, said, "You're President of the United States, you can't do this. Do not do this to yourself." And what I find in the Trump circumstance is that I'm in my book very tough on him because I think he does not know how to govern. And I also think that we have to understand the psychology of Trump in a deeper way. And part of my analysis of him is that how many people here have been elected President of the United States? Not even.
Not yet.
Not even. And he has. And it's had I mean, you've got to understand people told him, don't run, you can't win, but he did. And so he has this self-validation that we never get in our lives. I'm here. Yeah. And what I've discovered from trying to write about and understand 9 presidents from Nixon to Trump is they all experience isolation. They don't have, you talk to people and who work for presidents in their cabinet, I'm going to go in and I'm going to really lay out what I think. I'm going to make my argument. I'm going to give honest advice. And then they get in the Oval Office and strong people melt. And so,
do you think that's what happened with Nixon?
No. I think Nixon was demanded this kind of, I mean, there was not that lawyer who said you can't do it because Nixon didn't want that kind of lawyer in his midst. But what Trump has, if you read enough biographies of presidents or autobiographies, the books they write about themselves, you see that they all talk about destiny, that somehow this was not just an accident, but destined. And that further isolates people into thinking, I'm special, I've got answers. And so the White House is not a climate of doubt. And, as we all know, I mainline doubt. I think you have to doubt. The people in your world, the religious, spiritual world, are the most thoughtful ones also mainline doubt. And they know that you are living in a world of not absolute certainty. Is that true?
Yeah, as we say, we talk about inspiration and revelation, you have to know when you haven't received it, as well as when maybe you have.
Also in politics,
make that distinction.
Right? we could use more of that, for sure. Well, as we wrap up tonight, we always like to end with what we call Therefore What? Our audience has been fantastic tonight. They've heard a lot of incredible insight from history and from today in terms of these principles and trust. But the question really for all of us is therefore what? What do we do about it? What do you hope, just very briefly, each of you, what is it that you hope people walk away with tonight? People who will read reports of what took place in the Newseum tonight. What do you hope they walk away with? What do you hope they do different as a result of this experience?
You go.
Mike, we'll go to you, and then we'll go to Bob, and we'll let Elder Christofferson have the last word.
I guess I would just say that there's a bit of the more things change, the more they stay the same to some of these things. And that's just to say that there's a lot that feels extremely unique about the moment that we're in, whether you're thinking about technology or the individuals involved or the policy debates that are going on or shutdowns or whatever the divides of the moment are, but that there are sort of deeper underlying patterns to it of how we as societies adjust to changing political circumstances, economic circumstances, technological circumstances. These are long arc changes that we're going through all the time, and in the moment they feel deeply uncertain, but then you come out the other side and hopefully you learn something from it and move on.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks, Mike. Bob, what's the takeaway?
See, I don't know whether there is one, or I'm qualified to speculate on one, frankly, that you know, people will ask the question, well, what should we do about, you know, people who really love Trump or people who don't like him at all? And my reaction is, you know, that let the political system deal with it. And it's not my job. It really is out of my lane. And so I don't know that there's a summary of this. I think the missing piece in so much of what happens in the presidency, because I've spent so much time on this, I've tried to think, well, what's the job of the president? What's the job? And my answer is the job of the president is to determine the next stage of good for a majority of people in the country, not the base, not one party, not interest groups. And we could get a board here, and we could come up with sometimes it's winning a war, fixing the economy, healthcare. It's not elusive, the next stage of good. And presidents need to have, go back to process. What do we figure out what that is? Let's define it, have a strategy and plan to get there. President, and this is my optimistic side, presidents can do truly marvelous, great things. We have a great country because we've had lots of great or great plus or at least adequate presidents. And that's a full range, by the way. That you need to kind of step away and assess that not in a partisan or overly personal environment, but I mean, I have to say this because it's on my mind. In living in Trump world for a couple of years, as best I can tell, this never comes up.
Interesting.
That it's truly the dog that doesn't bark. And it's about him and his ideas, and there are scenes in my book where he will say something and they'll say, where, his aides, his cabinet, where do you get this idea? Well, I've had this idea for 30 years, and if you disagree with me, you're wrong. And so you have an environment, and I think we need to wake up to the reality of it. And this is not partisan. I insist it is repertorial. We have an environment where there is no strategy, and even worse, there's no team. Lots of people have left. The team, Reince Priebus, who was the White House chief of staff, says, Trump had, not like Lincoln, a team of rivals, but a team of predators. and he lists all the animals in the zoo. And he said, this is what the White House is like. And that is tragic.
All right. Elder Christofferson? Therefore what?
Just one point in that, answering that question. Institutions are people. Communities are people. Neighbors are people. And if we're talking about integrity, we're talking about trust, then it has to be personal. It has to be people. It has to be individuals. You can't talk about some organization. It's you and me. It's you and I together and individually who have to inculcate or adopt or incorporate into our character an unswerving commitment to that then may influence others and extend beyond and influence an institution, a neighborhood, a community, a society. But none of us can escape, I feel, the responsibility for our own selves, our own conduct, our own integrity. And that may be the greatest contribution we can make. For me, Watergate was an assault on the integrity of institutions that are crucial for society. And you documented it very well in your summary. But it didn't have the ultimate effect of destroying those institutions in our society, because good people, people of integrity, came to the fore and exercised their influence, and sometimes officially and sometimes unofficially, but people stood up. People who had integrity defended the institutions and the processes and our society. And I feel like we're obligated in our time to be the same kind of people. And in our roles, in our professions, in whatever setting, whether it's in a faith group or any other kind, to be the kind of people we're asking the rest of the world to be.
Wonderful. He could have been Deep Throat.
He could have been.
Opportunity.
He could have been. Yeah. All right, please help me thank our panelists tonight.